In this video, we're going to talk about the 1989 film, License to Kill. This is the 16th Bond film and the second and last Timothy Dalton 007 movie, and the fifth and also last Bond film directed by John Glen. A film that underperformed at the box office when it came out, but has quickly become a fan favorite and is now regarded as one of the best James Bond movies in the entire franchise, and is regarded as the closest James Bond film to Ian Fleming's version of the character. It has everything. It has insane heart-pounding action. It has a great villain in Robert Davi. It has a tough and adorable fan favorite Bond girl in Carey Lowell. And it has a drop-dead gorgeous femme fatale in Talisa Soto. It has Timothy Dalton resigning from MI6 and single-handedly going up against an international drug cartel using only his wits and a little help from Bouvier and 𝐾𝐿. It's a dark and gritty take on 007 2 decades before Daniel Craig would try to do it. I was a huge fan of Timothy Dalton ever since the last Bond film, The Living Daylights, and I really enjoyed that movie. I liked this new direction of James Bond, and I assumed that Timothy Dalton would be the next Bond for the next 4 or 5 more films. And I was really excited for this next Timothy Dalton 007 film. I saw a lot of potential for this new direction of James Bond, so I began to follow the hype. And I read all the pre-release gossip, I read all the magazines, this was before the internet. So I saw this movie in the theaters in the summer of 1989 on opening weekend. And it would actually start a tradition where I would see every James Bond movie from here on out on opening weekend, usually on opening night. I had a great time and I enjoyed it, but it wasn't exactly what I was expecting. I wanted something more like The Living Daylights. And for 2 decades, this continued to stay on the bottom tier of my rankings of James Bond movies. Then came the Pierce Brosnan era, and now the Daniel Craig era has come and gone, and I, along with an army of die-hard James Bond fans, have begun to rediscover this underrated gem. And seeing it now, post-Daniel Craig, this movie is phenomenal. And looking back, it almost seems like a miracle that it got made. Well, the origins of this movie came about during discussions between Timothy Dalton and the people of Eon, including Cubby Broccoli, Michael G. Wilson, and John Glen. And it was really Timothy Dalton who was driving this. Timothy Dalton had the idea to do something the James Bond franchise had never done before, to go back to the Ian Fleming novels and to create a 007 movie using the James Bond of the books. Dalton wanted to make a movie where James Bond doesn't rely on MI6 nor his flashy gadgets, but rather to use his own wits to beat the odds and survive a powerful villain. It was a gamble, but Cubby Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson were up to the challenge, and John Glen loved the idea. In the original story they wrote, it was going to take place in China, and Bond was going to take revenge on a Chinese drug lord, and it was going to be Bond versus the Golden Triad. And I admit, Bond going after a Chinese drug lord does seem a little more in the tradition of a James Bond story. And the story would loosely be based on Akira Kurosawa's 𝐬𝐿𝐫𝐞, where a samurai goes into a village and sows the seeds of distrust, and without directly killing the bad guys, had the main bad guy bring himself down because of paranoia and distrust. Now, if this plot seems familiar, it was remade into a Western by Sergio Leone starring Clint Eastwood and called A Fistful of Dollars. And it was also remade with Bruce Willis in 1996 as The Last Man Standing. And we see a little hint of this Chinese movie when the Hong Kong narcotics agents and ninjas inexplicably show up in the middle of the film. And this film was to have an exciting motorcycle chase along the Great Wall of China, as well as a fight scene in the Xi'an Museum amongst the ancient terracotta statues. However, the Chinese government made so many restrictive demands to the production crew that Eon decided it just wasn't worth it, and they pulled out of the project. And then they decided to change their filming site to Mexico and made the villain a South American drug lord instead of a Chinese drug lord. And for the country, they made up a fictional South American country called Isthmus, which was loosely based on Colombia and Panama. And while Richard Maibaum and Michael G. Wilson were writing the screenplay for this movie, the two had co-written For Your Eyes Only and then co-wrote Octopussy with George MacDonald Fraser, the two also co-wrote A View to a Kill and The Living Daylights, and this was the 5th screenplay they had started writing together. However, as they were writing, the Writers Guild of America went on strike, and that meant that Richard Maibaum could not work on the project. So Cubby Broccoli actually offered Richard Maibaum a lot of money to work under the table on this movie and sort of ghostwrite the movie along with Michael G. Wilson. However, Richard Maibaum was a loyal member of the Writers Guild, and had to turn down the offer. And that meant that Michael G. Wilson had to write the screenplay on his own. And while the story was not based on any Ian Fleming book nor short story, they did borrow elements from other books. Wilson based some of the character of Sanchez on Mr. Big from Live and Let Die, as well as Scaramanga from The Man with the Golden Gun, as well as Le Chiffre from the novel of Casino Royale. The moment where Felix Leiter has his legs bitten off by a shark came directly from the novel Live and Let Die. And some characters and moments came from a short story called The Hildebrandt Rarity. In the story, The Hildebrandt Rarity, which has nothing to do with License to Kill, that book was a story about an abusive millionaire who was looking for a rare fish. However, the name of that millionaire was Milton Krest, and his ship was called the Wave Crest. Furthermore, in that story, Milton Krest regularly abuses his wife by whipping her with the tail of a stingray. And they borrowed that element as well as the character of Milton Krest and had Sanchez regularly abuse Lupe by whipping her with the tail of a stingray. License to Kill is pretty much a completely new story, and it was the first James Bond movie that had almost no association with any of the novels or short stories written by Ian Fleming. And I actually remember seeing some of the posters, and it actually said License Revoked. So I was very surprised when the title was later changed to License to Kill. And the producers wanted to change the titles for two reasons. First, they did not want reviewers to be confused with John Gardner's book, License Renewed. And this is a whole big thing that happened in the 80s that I probably have to briefly explain here. So prior to 1981, there were only James Bond books written by Ian Fleming. And after Ian Fleming's death in 1964, Ian Fleming's estate allowed Gildrose Publications to write a new James Bond book. Gildrose Publishing was formed in 1964 when Kingsley Amis, under the pseudonym Robert Markham, wrote Colonel Sun, the first non-Ian Fleming James Bond novel. And in 1979, they hired British writer John Gardner to write and update James Bond for the modern audience of the 1980s. And his first novel was the 1981 License Renewed, and it was a huge hit back in 1981. And John Gardner would go on to write 14 more 007 books, followed by Raymond Benson, who would write 6 more books. And since then, there have been several authors who have written dozens of James Bond books post Ian Fleming. But it all started in 1981 with License Renewed. And I have to admit, when I saw License Revoked, I thought it was the movie version of License Renewed. And here's something really cool. John Gardner was later hired to write the novelization of this movie, License to Kill. The second reason that the producers changed the name from License Revoked to License to Kill was that in the U.S., License Revoked just means your driver's license is getting revoked, and they did not want their title to be associated with something so mundane. And incidentally, the producers also argued which spelling they should use for the movie. In the U.S., we spell license with an S, L-I-C-E-N-S-E, whereas in the UK they spell license with a C, L-I-C-E-N-C-E. So they debated this, and they decided to go with the British version of license spelled with a C. Incidentally, this will be Richard Maibaum's last 007 screenplay. After 12 James Bond scripts for Eon, he would pass away at the age of 81. And Richard Maibaum has had his fingerprints all over Bond's creation since Dr. No, and he's got an amazing resume. Richard Maibaum also wrote this film, License to Kill, and going backwards in order, he wrote The Living Daylights, A View to a Kill, Octopussy, For Your Eyes Only, The Spy Who Loved Me, The Man with the Golden Gun, Diamonds Are Forever, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, Thunderball, Goldfinger, From Russia with Love, and Dr. No. And he also helped write the screenplay for Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, which starred Dick Van Dyke and was based on the original novel by Ian Fleming. And he also wrote the screenplay for Ransom, the kidnapping story starring Mel Gibson. Say what you want about any of the James Bond movies that Richard Maibaum has written, and whether you prefer the campy movies or whether you prefer the more serious ones, whichever way you feel, you have to give recognition to Richard Maibaum for defining James Bond for 3 full decades. And this movie is going to be the end of an era, the end of the Richard Maibaum era. Another end of an era will come with Maurice Binder, who has been designing the opening montages ever since the first movie, Dr. No. And in fact, it was Maurice Binder who came up with the idea of the gun barrel sequence. And this will also be Maurice Binder's final movie, because he will pass away in 1991, shortly after this movie. And from here on out, next films, the Pierce Brosnan and the Daniel Craig films, will feel a little different from the ones that came before, because both Richard Maibaum and Maurice Binder are no longer involved due to their passing. Now, one of the first actors cast in this movie was Robert Davi, who was hired based on Cubby Broccoli's daughter Tina, who saw him in a movie called The Terrorist on Trial, the U.S. versus Salim Ajami, where Robert Davi played Salim Ajami. And besides this role, he's probably best known as his role as the FBI profiler, Agent Bailey Malone in Profiler, and as Special Agent Johnson in Die Hard, as well as Deputy Police Chief Phil Heineman in Predator 2. Robert Davi is a method actor and researched the Colombian drug cartels for this part and even studied how to do a Colombian accent. And folks say he stayed in character and continued to talk in a Colombian accent even when he was off set. And he would go to restaurants in Mexico and pretend he was a Mexican drug lord. And while the cast and crew were kind of had fun because they knew what he was doing, the folks in the restaurant and waiters really thought he was a powerful drug lord and would be serving him, yes sir, and serving him very attentively. Robert Davi was born in Queens, New York, and his mother was an Italian American and his father was Sicilian. And Robert Davi grew up speaking Italian. And Robert Davi grew up as a singer. He attended Seton Hall, where he studied opera, and at age 15, he was the winner of the New York State School of Music Association's solo competition. He graduated from Hofstra University and studied drama, and he moved to Manhattan and was a member of the Actors Studio and even studied with Lee Strasberg. And his big break came when he landed a recurring role on the 1989 TV series Wise Guy and appeared as Jake Fratelli in The Goonies. Now, for the role of Pam Bouvier, they considered Lea Thompson, and that would have been very interesting. However, Lea Thompson turned it down to star in Back to the Future Part 2. Carey Lowell actually came into the audition dressed in a jeans and a jean jacket, but was told to go get a dress and return for the rest of the audition. Carey Lowell was cast as the CIA contract pilot Pam Bouvier, and she's probably best known for her role here, and also as District Attorney Jamie Ross on the TV drama Law and Order. And after being cast as Pam Bouvier, Carey Lowell binge-watched almost every James Bond movie to get inspiration on how to play a Bond girl. Carey Lowell was born in Huntington, New York, but grew up in Denver, Colorado, and attended the University of Colorado at Boulder, where she studied literature, but dropped out to move to New York to pursue modeling and work for Ralph Lauren and Calvin Klein. And she broke into acting with a few small roles, but License to Kill was her big break. She then starred in seasons 7 and 8 on Law and Order, and returned as a recurring character in season 10 and 11 and season 21. And in November 2002, Carey Lowell was married to actor Richard Gere, and they have one son, but that ended bitterly in a highly contested divorce in 2013. In 2012, Carey Lowell returned to the James Bond franchise, add her likeness and her voice to reprise Pam Bouvier in the video game 007 Legends. For the role of Lupe Lamora, we have Talisa Soto, who is absolutely gorgeous. And she is probably best known for her role here as Lupe and also as Princess Katana in the Mortal Kombat series. And Timothy Dalton was unavailable to do the screen test, so Robert Davi filled in. And if you look at the screen test, Robert Davi actually made a pretty good James Bond. And after interviewing opposite 12 candidates, Talisa Soto was Robert Davi's favorite actress. And when the producers asked him what he thought, he commented, "I'd kill for her." And apparently that was enough, and the producers liked that comment enough that they cast her in this movie. So Talisa Soto actually has Robert Davi to thank for being hired for this role. When Talisa Soto auditioned for the role of Lupe, she had a tearaway dress that impressed everybody. They liked that dress so much that they used it in the movie, where Pam Bouvier reveals a tearaway dress in the elevator of the casino to hand Bond her gun. Talisa Soto was born in Brooklyn, New York, but her family moved to Puerto Rico, where she grew up, before moving to Northampton, Massachusetts. She began modeling at the age of 15 and was featured in Vogue, Elle, Mademoiselle, Glamour, and Self magazines, and has been featured in ads for Calvin Klein, Cartier, Revlon, Saks Fifth Avenue, and Versace, and many, many more. Her big break in acting was being cast in this movie, and then in 1990, she was chosen by People magazine as one of the 50 most beautiful people in the world. And in 2002, she was ranked number 58 on the Maxim Hot 100 Women of 2002. David Hedison returned to play Felix Leiter after playing him 16 years earlier in Live and Let Die. And he was the first actor to ever play Felix Leiter in more than one film. And of course, Jeffrey Wright, who played Felix in Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace and No Time to Die, will be the second actor to ever play Felix Leiter in more than one film. And how David Hedison got cast was that Cubby Broccoli, Dana Broccoli, and John Glen were having lunch, and they ran into David Hedison at the restaurant, and he just said hi and goodbye. But Dana remarked how great he looked, and how even after 16 years, he still looked very similar to how he looked in Live and Let Die. And so Cubby Broccoli and Dana began to consider casting him as Felix Leiter. However, John Glen had some concerns. After all, the movie is supposed to start with Felix Leiter and Bond parachuting into his wedding. However, after meeting with David Hedison, John Glen was won over by how much of a nice guy David Hedison was and decided to give him a chance and agreed to the casting. Well, John Glen may have been onto something by being concerned about the parachuting. While filming that sequence, David Hedison really parachuted from the plane, and the first take was almost perfect. In fact, it was the shot used in the film. However, they thought they can film a slightly better landing, and David Hedison jumped out of the plane a second time for the second take. Well, it did not go well. David Hedison landed incorrectly and bam, fell on the hard ground, and he actually hurt himself. He had to go to the doctor, and while there were no serious injuries, he did hurt himself enough that he had to hide a slight limp throughout every scene filmed thereafter. Now, an interesting character that shows up in this movie is Benicio del Toro, who was a complete unknown, and director John Glen cast him in this movie because, in his own words, he was laid back while menacing in a quirky sort of way. And he is just pure evil and off-kilter and completely sadistic and crazy as Sanchez's loyal henchman. Just the moment he shows up on screen, you really help him and you just cheer when he gets his comeuppance when James Bond and Pam Bouvier kill him. For the opening action sequence where James Bond hangs down from a helicopter onto the tail of Sanchez's plane, again, this stunt was really done. James Bond franchise regular stuntman Jake Lombard filled in for Timothy Dalton and sure enough hung down from a moving helicopter and landed on top of a real plane, a real moving Cessna airplane in flight thousands of feet above the ground, flying at over 100 miles an hour. And this required Jake Lombard to basically do a free fall from a helicopter and land on the plane of the airplane. However, in reality, he could not land on the back of the airplane because the plane would stall in mid-flight. And so he had to make gentle contact and then let go. And the rest of the scene would be continued on the ground using a model replica that was only 10 feet off the ground. And for that scene, there was the other half where Jake Lombard would be suspended from a real helicopter and he would land on the replica of the tail of the Cessna that was about 10 feet off the ground with wind machines to simulate the wind of an airplane in flight. And while this was safer than landing on a real airplane, it still required hanging off of a real helicopter. Well, Timothy Dalton saw this and actually wanted to do the stunt himself, so Jake Lombard let him. They hooked Timothy Dalton onto the helicopter and he was suspended down and landed on the replica of the tail. And that's why we can get so many close-ups of James Bond landing on the back of the plane. It's because Timothy Dalton actually did the stunt. Well, Cubby Broccoli came by the set, he got out of his car, he looked and saw Jake Lombard sitting there, and then he looked up and saw Timothy Dalton was actually doing the stunt, and he supposedly yelled, "Get my actor off that helicopter, I can't risk him getting hurt." Well, when they filmed that sequence, they put it all together, and it looked fantastic. For the scene where James Bond water skis barefoot while escaping Milton Krest's men, world champion skier David Reinhardt actually performed the water skiing scenes and really did barefoot water ski. And for the close-up shots, Timothy Dalton was riding a special rig that made him look like he was barefoot water skiing. And for the location of Sanchez's mansion, they used Arabesque, a mansion in Acapulco, and it was owned by a friend of Cubby Broccoli's who lent it to the production to film this movie. Due to the thin air of Mexico as well as the pollution, many people on the set of License to Kill actually got sick while filming the movie and really struggled. Fortunately, Cubby Broccoli came to Mexico for the filming of License to Kill and he got very sick. Cubby Broccoli, who had just turned 80 years old, had difficulty with the air. He struggled to breathe the thin air as well as the pollution, and it was a terrible combination, and Cubby Broccoli got so sick that he was almost hospitalized. Therefore, he had to go back to the US, and once he was back in New York, he made a full recovery. However, he could not go back to Mexico, and therefore, this was the first James Bond movie that Cubby Broccoli could not observe the filming. Fortunately, he had complete faith in his team and in Michael G. Wilson, and delegated the making of this movie to his team. Now, for the climactic tanker chase, this sequence was filmed on the dangerous La Rumorosa Road, which had been closed down at the time of filming because of fatal accidents occurring on the snake-like twists and turns. Remy Julien, whose team did the car stunts in A View to a Kill, was hired for License to Kill to film this final sequence. However, this final sequence was very difficult to film due to the many bizarre accidents that kept taking place. In one scene where the two semi-trucks were meant to keep crashing into each other, however, the car on the right made a mistake and actually went up the mountain, and then when it came down, it was crushed by the truck on the left. This was not supposed to happen. However, the footage looked so spectacular that they ended up using it in the movie. Another mishap involved that dummy rocket that Sanchez and Robert Davi used to bring down Pam's plane. Well, the rocket traveled 2.5 miles, striking and injuring a telephone worker who fractured his elbow because of the rocket. Other accidents happened when stuntmen fell off trucks. In one scene, Timothy Dalton almost was severely injured when Dalton was driving the truck and the road had been cleared. There shouldn't have been other cars, but mysteriously enough, another driver was on the other side of the road coming toward him, and Dalton narrowly missed him but almost went over the edge. And if he had, Dalton would have most likely either been seriously injured or possibly killed due to the height that he would have fallen. Then there were also the supposed supernatural errors that kept happening, where John Glen claimed that he would see strange figures on filming, but then when he would send security guards to clear the scene, they would disappear. And so the crew began to suspect that maybe that area might be haunted. And upon investigation, they discovered that that stretch of road actually was known to the locals as actually being haunted. Apparently, years ago, 5 nuns were riding in a van that crashed, and all 5 nuns were killed. And therefore, the crew began to be certain that that road was cursed. And you've probably heard about the famous mysterious hand that appeared in one of the scenes. Oh, this is really creepy. If you haven't heard this, check this out. In the scene where Bond ignites a tanker truck with a huge explosion, well, that scene went off without a hitch. Well, a photographer was also shooting the photos while that scene took place, and when he was looking at the photos, one of the photos looked like a flaming hand was coming out of the flames. And it was really creepy. They actually looked back and reviewed the camera footage, but they could not find that hand. So it was really bizarre. And it just added to the lore of that road and that scene being haunted. Now, from the start of the movie, you can already see that License to Kill starts off with a very different gun barrel sequence, where the music is more intense and brooding. And from here, it's a way for the filmmakers to tell us from the very beginning that this is going to be a very different Bond film. We open up in the Florida Keys, and the DEA is tracking this elusive criminal named Franz Sanchez, who's making a very rare appearance in the U.S. Meanwhile, nearby, Felix Leiter, played by David Hedison, is getting married, and James Bond is his best man, and 𝐼𝐵𝐿𝐼 is his groomsman. And Felix is no longer working for the CIA, but is now a DEA agent. And other DEA agents stop Felix and inform him that Sanchez is nearby, and this is a once-in-a-lifetime chance to catch him. And this agent here is DEA agent Hawkins, and he's played by Grandel Bush, who 1 year earlier in 1988 played FBI agent Johnson in Die Hard. In fact, in that movie, there were 2 FBI agents. Robert Davi played Big Johnson, and Grandel Bush played Little Johnson. Felix decides that catching Sanchez is a little more important than his own wedding, and Bond goes to accompany him, leaving 𝐼𝐵𝐿𝐼 to explain to his wife that Felix is going to be a little late to his own wedding. It turns out that Sanchez is in the area because he's looking for his girlfriend, Lupe Lamora, played by Talisa Soto, and I remember there was a lot of hype around her before the release of this movie, listing her as one of the top most beautiful actresses of that year. Lupe has escaped Sanchez with the help of this poor simp, and when Sanchez catches up to him, it's not going to be good for this poor guy, who has his heart cut out with a knife. So Lupe has gotten this poor guy killed, and she has to go back home to Sanchez, but before they go, she has to be punished. and Sanchez takes out a whip, which is a stingray tail, and he whips her. And you get the feeling that this is a regular thing in the Sanchez household. That Sanchez makes an escape in his private jet, but Felix and Bond chase him in a helicopter. And I wondered, can a helicopter really fly faster than a small plane? Well, let's analyze this. Generally, an airplane flies faster than a helicopter due to the aerodynamics. Sanchez's plane is a Cessna 172 Skyhawk, and I'll admit I actually know how to fly this particular plane. The helicopter that Bond and Felix fly in is a Eurocopter AS-365 Dolphin. The Eurocopter AS-365 has a maximum speed of 190 miles per hour. The Cessna 172 Skyhawk has a maximum speed of 160 miles per hour. So, Leiter's helicopter would indeed be faster than Sanchez's airplane. So this scene is accurate. Who knew? Bond drops down from the helicopter and onto Sanchez's tail and ties it up. And this sequence will also influence other films. And one of the huge fans of this movie is Christopher Nolan, who loved License to Kill and loved this scene and used it as inspiration for the airplane kidnapping scene in The Dark Knight Rises. Incidentally, the semi-truck scene at the end of the movie will also inspire the semi-truck flipping scene in The Dark Knight. After successfully catching Sanchez, Bond and Leiter notice that they're actually over the church where Leiter has to be married, and Bond and Felix parachute down, making a very dramatic entrance to their wedding. And incidentally, this is where Felix got hurt doing a second take. Speaking of influences and inspirations, this movie does feel a lot like Miami Vice. And Bond movies have always been influenced by cinematic zeitgeists of the era. Live and Let Die was influenced by blaxploitation. The Man with the Golden Gun was influenced by Hong Kong martial arts. Moonraker was influenced by Star Wars. And here you can absolutely see the influence of Miami Vice, which was hot on TV at the time. But also influenced by Scarface, as well as other 1980s drug lord movies like Black Rain, Colors, Red Heat, The Year of the Dragon, and many more. Now for the music, John Barry could not work on this movie because he was bedridden from a ruptured esophagus. So John Glen hired Michael Kamen because he had a very similar style to John Barry. And Michael Kamen had written the musical score to Die Hard and Lethal Weapon, as well as The Adventures of Baron Munchausen and Highlander. And for the opening song, they originally hired Eric Clapton and Vic Flick, who wrote an early version of the song, but their song was rejected. Now, the opening music song that was used was eventually written by Narada Michael Walden, Jeffrey Cohen, and Walter Adamcev, and performed by Gladys Knight. And the trio wrote the song based on a horn line from the Goldfinger song, and you can definitely hear the similarities. And this song has become a fan favorite among James Bond fans. Sanchez is convicted, and Felix has his wedding. And Felix Leiter's wife is Della Churchill, played by Priscilla Barnes, who was most famous at the time in the U.S. as Terry Alden, the roommate who replaced Chrissy Snow in the last 3 seasons of the sitcom classic Three's Company from 1981 to 1984, after Jenny Lee Harrison's Cindy Snow briefly replaced Suzanne Summers. And it is clear that by taking this role here, Priscilla Barnes was trying to break the typecasting from her role as Terry in Three's Company. And it somewhat worked, because she was able to parlay this role into several movie roles like Stepfather 3, The Crossing Guard, Mallrats, The Devil's Rejects, and The Visitation. And then in 2014, she had a recurring role in Jane the Virgin. And back in 1989, when I saw it in the theaters, it was odd to see Terry Alden in a Bond movie, much less in such a dark role. However, it's weird today because I've seen this movie so much that I completely associate Priscilla Barnes in this role rather than her role in Three's Company. And during the wedding reception, Felix is still working, including meeting with an informant who we'll later learn is Pam Bouvier. And later that night, Felix and his new bride give Bond a lighter to honor their friendship. Get it? Lighter, lighter? It's sweet. And when Bond says goodnight to the couple, there's this sadness about him. And when Della asks Felix if she said anything wrong, Felix tells her
he was married once, but it was a long time ago.
A reference to Teresa Bond, who was murdered by Blofeld on their wedding day. And I love this. It's a nice bit of continuity that connects Timothy Dalton's Bond with Roger Moore's Bond and ultimately with George Lazenby's Bond. I love that they honor the lore and history of the James Bond character, although this reminder of tragedy is going to foreshadow that Felix Leiter himself will experience a similar great tragedy. So Sanchez offers $2 million to anyone that'll help him escape, and DEA agent 𝐸𝐿Ifer decides to take the offer and coordinates a daring underwater escape from Sanchez, presumably with Milton Krest's men. And Christopher Nolan said that this escape scene also inspired the semi-truck scene in The Dark Knight. And I hope one day we do get to see a Christopher Nolan directed James Bond film. And on their wedding night, Sanchez and his men ambush Felix Leiter and his wife, and they knock out Leiter and take him to Krest's warehouse, and they murder Della. And at the warehouse, Milton Krest suggests that they kill DEA agent 𝐸𝐿Ifer to tie up loose ends, but Sanchez tells him that loyalty is the most important thing to him, and that he'll always keep his word, and he pays 𝐸𝐿Ifer the $2 million. And one of Sanchez's men is Dario, played by a young Benicio del Toro, and again, he is just so great here as this evil, sadistic, terrifying thug. And when Leiter asks him where his wife is, he answers in the creepiest way.
Don't worry. We gave her a nice honeymoon.
And wow, that is so chilling. And they devise a torture for Leiter where he gets his legs eaten by a great white shark that is being kept underneath Milton Krest's warehouse. And at the airport, Bond hears that some drug dealers escaped, and he knows it's Sanchez. And he immediately goes to check in on Felix's house and sees that Della has been murdered, and Felix is tortured, although he's barely alive. And we see James Bond seething with anger, and you can see him vow to himself to get revenge on Sanchez and bring down that whole organization. He first goes to Milton Krest's warehouse and asks about great white sharks, but Milton Krest denies that he has any. But Bond spots a white wedding carnation and knows that Felix was likely tortured here. So at night, he and Sharky investigates the warehouse and sure enough sees that they've captured a great white shark. And I love Sharky in this movie. He's just this big lovable oaf, and he's played by character actor Frank McCrae, who has these small parts in just about every movie you've seen. He's been in Rocky II, National Lampoon's Vacation, Red Dawn, Last Action Hero. He was in 48 Hours as Captain Hayden. He's the angry boss who calls Eddie Murphy the N-word. He always shows up everywhere. So they spot a bunch of bags of cocaine, which Milton Krest is smuggling using a small submarine. And Milton Krest is played by Anthony Zerbe, who's also been in everything from the Wild Wild West TV show, Mission Impossible, Gunsmoke, Hawaii Five-0, How the West Was Won. Today, he's probably best remembered for his role here and as Admiral Doherty in Star Trek Insurrection. Bond takes out two of Sanchez's men, one with the worms and another with an electric eel. However, 𝐸𝐿Ifer gets a drop on Bond, but Sharky accidentally trips Killifer, and Bond is able to turn the tables on him. And now 𝐸𝐿Ifer is hanging for dear life, but Bond throws a briefcase of money at him, which causes him to drop into the shark tank, causing him to be eaten by the shark. And Sharky notes that it's a terrible waste
of money.
The next day, Bond is taken to an office where M is there demanding that he return to MI6, and Bond hands in his resignation, and M revokes his license to kill. And for a second, it looked like Bond kicks M in the stomach, but I had to rewind it, and it's the agent next to him that gets kicked. See, the blue suit? M is wearing a gray suit. Well, Bond runs away in his quest to avenge his friend Felix Leiter, and now he's a rogue agent trying to bring down the world's most powerful and dangerous drug lord all by himself.
God help you, Commander.
We then go to the Wave Krest, where we see Milton Krest acting totally creepy to Sanchez's girlfriend, Lupe. And while Bond uses a fake manta ray outfit to sneak aboard the Wave Krest, and Milton Krest is Sanchez's top man in Florida who receives Sanchez's cocaine and moves it inside the U.S., while he also takes the money he made and sends it back to Sanchez. Today is the day that Milton Krest will receive his shipment of cocaine from Sanchez and also give Sanchez his money. And Sanchez's plane arrives with the cocaine, and they unload the cocaine into Krest's little submarine and take the money raised for Sanchez. And then one of Milton Krest's boat arrives, and we see that one of Milton Krest's men had captured and murdered Sharky. And Bond is furious, calmly walks up to him, and kills the goon with a harpoon gun. And then he begins to destroy Sanchez's cocaine, and that's got to be millions of dollars of cocaine. So Krest sends his men to catch this interloper. But Bond uses his harpoon gun to latch onto a flying Cessna airplane and then barefoot water skis. And this action scene is totally awesome. And Timothy Dalton totally makes you not only believe that Bond can barefoot water ski to catch an airplane, but that maybe Timothy Dalton could also do it too. And that's why I love Timothy Dalton's Bond. You really believe that he can do the action scenes. Bond gets on the airplane and throws Sanchez's henchmen and the pilot out of the plane, and now he's free and has millions of dollars of Sanchez's money. And according to the script, this was $5 million of Sanchez's money. Money which now Milton Krest will be responsible for. Bond investigates Leiter's house and searches his computers and learns that every contact that has been investigating with Leiter has been murdered. All except one last one named P. Bouvier, whom Leiter was supposed to meet at a local barrelhead bar in Bimini, an island 50 miles east of Florida. And in a deleted scene, Bond goes up to an owner of a random boat and buys the boat from him, and he gives him $200,000 out of the $5 million he stole from Sanchez. And that's why he and Pam Bouvier are able to escape on a boat after Pam blows a hole through the wall at the Barrelhead Bar. So Bond goes to Bimini and meets up with Pam Bouvier, an ex-Army pilot and DEA informant who is a contract pilot for the CIA. And actress Carey Lowell has short hair, so for the scene where Pam Bouvier has long curly hair, that's actually a wig. And she is one tough cookie, even carrying a shotgun into the bar to protect herself. And she's a great Bond girl and a total fan favorite. But Dario and his goons come to Bond and Pam, and when Darius pulls out a knife, Bond just knocks him out, causing a huge 80s bar fight. Pam shoots a hole in the wall of the bar, and the two escape on Bond's new boat, and Bond hires Bouvier to charter a plane to Isthmus, and they haggle over the price, and presumably, once they settle on the price, they make love on the boat. And we then go to the fictional country of Isthmus, where we see that Sanchez pretty much owns the entire country. He owns the country's bank, he owns the casinos, he even owns the president of Isthmus, whom he frequently pays off with bribes. And when the president complains that this month's bribe money was too small, Sanchez reminds him,
"Remember, you're only president for life."
Incidentally, the president of Isthmus is played by Pedro Armendariz Jr., and his father, Pedro Armendariz, played Kerim Bey in From Russia with Love. And the character of Sanchez was based on two real historical figures, Manuel Noriega, who was the dictator of Panama, and Pablo Escobar, who led the Medellin cartel of Colombia, who are known for their ruthless tactics, including violence, assassinations, bribery, while maintaining tight control over the politics of Colombia. Bond and Pam check into a hotel in Isthmus, and he deposits the drug money into the bank, and when Pam gets a makeover to pose as Bond's secretary, he even makes Bond do a double take. And I love Carey Lowell with short hair. She was cute with this longer hair, but there's something about her with the short hair that is so adorable and sexy. And boy, does she look great in that dress. And the more I watch this movie, the more Pam Bouvier, played by Carey Lowell, just keeps moving up in my list of favorite Bond girls. And I have to ask, where does Pam Bouvier rank on your list of favorite Bond girls? Please list in the comment below. Now, Pam Bouvier addresses herself as her alias, Mrs. Kennedy. And this is actually a nod to First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, and eventually Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, whose maiden name was Bouvier. We also get to learn a little bit more about Sanchez's organization. First, we learn that Sanchez has a pet iguana that he lets sit on his shoulder. And this iguana has a huge diamond collar around its neck. And that's just so random, but it does add a little to his character. And the fact that he has an iguana was supposed to be an homage to Blofeld, who always has a white cat with a diamond collar. But it's just a little weirder here. And we also learn that there's this TV show that is raising money for a religious organization, presumably some religious cult, and the host is played by Wayne Newton, who is playing this cult leader's Professor Joe Butcher. However, in reality, the show is controlled by Sanchez, who uses the show to communicate to his drug dealer customers, and this is just how they communicate and order their shipment of drugs. And this is just so cool, and it shows you how powerful Sanchez is. Bond then goes to Sanchez's casino, and he pretends to lose at first, but once the stakes on the table are raised, he begins to beat the house at blackjack. And as planned, this attracts the attention of Sanchez and his top men. So Sanchez sends Lupe down to play blackjack with Bond, and we have to assume that Lupe is an advanced level card handler. And here Bond tells Pam to get his favorite drink, and I love how Timothy Dalton orders it.
Would you get me a medium dry vodka martini?
What is
Shaken, not stirred.
And it's so cool and so tough. And for me, it's become the most memorable and iconic way that any Bond orders his favorite drink. And the way Pam orders a drink always makes me laugh. It's just so cute. Lupe recognizes Bond from earlier in Florida and advises him to leave the country. However, Bond convinces Lupe to escort him to meet Sanchez. And in Sanchez's office, Bond scopes things out and notices that his window has bulletproof glass, and that there's a construction site across the street. And Bond tells Sanchez that he helps people with problems, and when Sanchez asks if he's a problem solver, he answers,
I'm more of a problem eliminator.
In other words, he is asking Sanchez as a job to be his hitman. And here's where we get 007's 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐫𝐢 start. He is slowly sowing the seeds of paranoia in Sanchez's mind, where Sanchez begins to wonder if he has traitors in his organization. And eventually we're going to watch Bond trick Sanchez into killing his top 3 men. First, Sanchez will kill his top Florida man, Milton Krest. Then he'll kill his head of security, Colonel Heller. And finally, Sanchez will kill his own accountant, Truman Lodge, before Bond will kill Sanchez himself. But Sanchez takes Bond's passport and has Colonel Heller check him out, so it's going to be a matter of time before they find out who Bond really is. So Bond and Pam go back to their hotel, and we the audience notice that he's being followed by mysterious Asian figures. And one of them is Carey Hiroyuki Tagawa, who is best known as Shang Tsung in the 1994 Mortal Kombat. And that's the second person in this movie who'll go on to play a main character in the Mortal Kombat movie. And at the hotel, Bond is informed that his uncle has checked in. And so Bond is on high alert and he borrows Pam's gun. And I love this. Pam has this tearaway dress and keeps a gun in her thigh holster. And every time I see this movie, Pam Bouvier just moves higher on my rankings. So Bond enters the room and it's Q. Moneypenny has arranged for Q to take leave and go to Isthmus City to help Bond. And I think that is so sweet. And this really establishes a nice relationship between Q and Bond that we've never seen before. Because with past Bonds, Q genuinely seemed to dislike Sean Connery's Bond, and he was overtly annoyed by Roger Moore. But with Dalton, he genuinely cares about him and really goes out of his way to help him. And I just love this. And as for actor Desmond Llewelyn, he said that having such a prominent role in a James Bond movie allowed him to be paid more for this movie. And he said that he made more on License to Kill than he had on all the previous Bond movies combined. Q gives Bond a sniper rifle with an optical handprint so that only he can fire the gun. He gives him some toothpaste that's really an explosive. And it's just a great moment. You know, these little elements with Pam and these moments with Q, that's what makes License to Kill so special as a 007 movie. Then Sanchez is meeting with Asian drug dealers, and in many ways, the scene is reminiscent of Goldfinger or A View to a Kill, where he offers them a cut of a very lucrative business deal in exchange for a large upfront payment. Among the drug dealers is 𝐿, again played by Tagawa, who is a Hong Kong narcotics agent trying to infiltrate Sanchez's organization. And Bond has this cool sequence where he poses as a waiter and makes it to the roof of the casino, then rappels down to the window and onto the ledge where he applies explosives onto the windowsill, and the detonator looks like a pack of cigarettes. We get John Glenn's signature of a pigeon giving a false scare, and then Bond goes across the street to kill Sanchez. However, he spots Pam Bouvier in Sanchez's office talking to Colonel Heller, and now Bond doesn't know what to think. We will later find out that Sanchez has obtained 2 Stinger missiles and is planning to shoot down an American aircraft, and Sanchez's chief of security, Heller, is planning on betraying Sanchez, handing over the Stinger missiles in exchange for immunity back to the U.S. And later, Bond is going to use this information to convince Sanchez that people in his organization are betraying him left and right. However, just as Bond is about to kill Sanchez, a group of ninjas who are working for 𝐾, come in and kidnap Bond. And here we learn that 𝐿 is a Hong Kong narcotics agent, but Sanchez and the Isthmus Army break into 𝐿's hideout and kill the Hong Kong agents. 𝐿 commits suicide at the last minute, and Sanchez discovers Bond all tied up. And when Bond wakes up, he's in Sanchez's home, which is incredible. I mean, this is a beautiful mansion, and it's really a house that exists in Acapulco. So Bond thinks fast, and using his wits, he tells Sanchez that he's former British intelligence, since it's only a matter of time before Sanchez finds that out anyway, and he convinces Sanchez that as British intelligence, he recognizes the agents as a freelance hit team that was hired by a traitor on his team, and he's going to make Sanchez think that this traitor is Martin Krest, because Bond tells him that the traitor is coming in tonight with a big shipment, and that Sanchez knows is that Krest is due to come in tonight. That night, Bond takes the money he stole from Martin Krest, the $5 million, a little bit taken out, and he and Pam place the money in Krest's decompression chamber. and Pam takes off her harbor pilot disguise and she's wearing her undergarments, and Bond does another double take. And man, I had to do a double take myself, because wow, Carey Lowell. Sanchez finds the money and it looks bad for Krest. Bond has done an excellent job of making Sanchez believe that Krest was stealing from him and was going to have him killed. And Krest, who is totally innocent, is so confused. I mean, he has no idea what's going on, and you almost feel sorry for him. Sanchez kills Krest, and when his men ask him what to do with the money that's covered in Milton Krest's blood, he says,
Launder it.
Bond barely makes it back to Sanchez's mansion in time, and Sanchez is very happy with Bond and the information that he gave him, and Bond continues to sow distrust and makes Sanchez think that Krest was probably working with someone else in his organization. And he clearly has his eyes on targeting Colonel Heller and the accountant Truman Lodge next. And Bond celebrates by sleeping with Sanchez's girlfriend. And we reach the final set piece of the movie, where Sanchez takes Bond and the Asian drug dealers to his distribution center, which for cover is a religious cult base called the Olympotech Meditation Institute, led by televangelist Professor Joe Butcher, played by Wayne Newton. And this place really does exist in Mexico. It is the Otomi site at Toluca, known as the Centro Ceremonial Otomi, and it's a heritage center celebrating and preserving the culture of the indigenous Otomi people of Mexico. And it was established in 1980 and built in 1988. And this scene where a helicopter pad opens up, this really doesn't exist. It was created by a miniature in the foreground. And it's a flawless illusion, because man, they really knew how to do special effects in the 1980s. And in the laboratory, Sanchez informs them that he's discovered a method to hide cocaine inside gasoline, and that he can purify the cocaine out of the gasoline once it has arrived into the people's country. Meanwhile, Pam Bouvier poses as a naive member of the religious cult, and she meets up with Professor Joe Butcher, who is just played with brilliant creepiness and douchebaggery. And I love that Wayne Newton's catchphrase is,
Bless your heart.
and his character being the televangelist, Professor Joe Butcher, was an intentional dig at real-world televangelists who were in the news for similar scandals at the time. So it was topical. Jim Bakker was in the news in 1987 for sexual misconduct with his church secretary, and Jimmy Swaggart was in the news in 1988 for being a patron of the ladies of the evening. Everything is going according to Bond's plan. However, Dario is at the lab and he recognizes Bond, and now Bond's plan is destroyed. But Bond is able to set the laboratory on fire. Sanchez and Dario tie Bond up and put him on the conveyor belt, but Sanchez has to get out of there, so Dario stays behind to make sure Bond dies. But before Sanchez leaves, Bond convinces him that Heller is about to betray him by taking the Stinger missiles. And sure enough, when Sanchez sees Heller, he is taking Sanchez's 2 Stinger missiles. So Sanchez kills Heller, though it is off screen. And you see Sanchez slowly becoming paranoid, and he begins to see betrayal everywhere. And it is awesome, because now we know Bond has gotten inside of Sanchez's head. Well, Dario is about to kill Bond, but to the rescue comes Pam Bouvier. And she shoots Dario and makes him fall into the grinder, and his legs initially get grinded in a manner very similar to Felix Leiter, just before Dario's entire body is grounded up. And that is hardcore. And this is why I love Pam Bouvier so much. In a lot of past Bond movies, the Bond girl was a poor damsel in distress, and Bond has to save her. But in this movie, the Bond girl saves him, and saves him several times, and she continues to come through for Bond. In no other movie in the entire Bond franchise is the Bond girl so essential to Bond completing his mission than Pam Bouvier is in this movie. She is so helpful to Bond that he couldn't have done the mission without her. And that's why she's one of the best Bond girls in the history of the 007 franchise. And while the whole laboratory and the meditation center go up in flames, Sanchez and Truman Lodge leave the base with 4 tankers full of cocaine. However, Bond and Pam steal Sanchez's airplane, and Bond lands on one of the tankers, and this is an incredible action sequence. Bond takes over one of the tankers, and one of the Stinger missiles gets fired at Bond, but he drives the tanker onto one side, causing the missile to blow up one of the tankers behind him. And one by one, he destroys the other tankers, causing Sanchez and his organization to lose over $80 million of cocaine. And when Truman Lodge freaks out, Sanchez, who is now paranoid and sees betrayal and disrespect everywhere, kills Truman Lodge. And now Sanchez has killed his top 3 men, Milton Krest, Colonel Heller, and Truman Lodge. Bond has successfully gone full Yojimbo on Sanchez's cartel. Bond and Sanchez are in the last truck, and Bond crashes the truck down the hill, and we see that Sanchez's suit is wet from the gasoline, while Bond's suit is dry. And when Sanchez asks Bond why he betrayed him, Bond shows Sanchez the lighter that Felix gave him, and he lights it, engulfing Sanchez in flames. And now Bond has successfully avenged Felix Leiter and Della. And the movie ends with a party at Sanchez's mansion. Lupe has taken ownership of Sanchez's pet iguana, and for a second we think that Bond might end up with Lupe, and we all in the audience yell, "No! We want Bond to end up with Pam Bouvier." And you know Pam Bouvier is a great Bond girl when you have someone as beautiful as Talisa Soto, but I think almost everyone wanted Bond to be with Pam. And in a nice goofy moment, Bond gets to be silly and he jumps into the pool after her, and it's a cute moment. And I love these two, and thus ends a fantastic James Bond movie. A film that many fans of the Ian Fleming novels will cite as the closest that the movies have come to capturing the essence and spirit of James Bond of the Ian Fleming novels. Now, this movie had a budget of $32 million, but it did have a little disappointing box office in the US. In the US, it only made $34 million, which didn't quite cover the $32 million budget, and it ranks as the single worst James Bond film when adjusted for inflation when you deal with US box office. Worse than The Man with the Golden Gun, worse than On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Fortunately, this movie did very well internationally, and it brought in a total of $156 million, which made this movie a moderate success overall. Unfortunately, nowhere near the $191 million of the last film, The Living Daylights, but still very profitable. So profitable that they were interested in making a third Timothy Dalton James Bond movie. But the story of why they never made a third film is very interesting. Now, it should be mentioned that License to Kill was up against extremely stiff competition in 1989, and poor License to Kill was just crowded out by the competition. Because remember, this was the summer of 1989, and you know what movies came out that summer alongside this one. This was the year of Tim Burton's Batman, but it was also the year of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, ironically starring past James Bond Sean Connery. But it was also the summer of Ghostbusters 2, Back to the Future 2, The Lethal Weapon 2, and Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, and Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, as well as many, many more. In other words, this movie really didn't stand a chance, especially since they were doing some experimental interpretation of 007. So because of the disappointing box office of License to Kill, ever since 1989, James Bond movies have always been released in November or December to avoid the competition with other summer blockbusters. Have you noticed that? Prior to this film, Bond movies were always summer blockbusters. Ever since Spy Who Loved Me, James Bond has always been released in the summer. However, after License to Kill, all the Pierce Brosnan films, all the Daniel Craig films, they're going to be released in either November or December. And it's largely been a strategy that works. Now, critically, it was quite mixed when it came out, but overall leaning to the positive. Many found the darker tone very interesting, and critics loved the action, and they generally liked Timothy Dalton. However, many critics criticized the by-the-numbers plot, while some critics even called it dull. However, Roger Ebert loved License to Kill and said it was one of the best James Bond movies to come out in a while. Now, in terms of popularity, time has been very kind to this movie, and this movie has many fans today and has developed somewhat of a cult following. Today, many fans absolutely love this movie and consider it their favorite Bond film, or at least in their top 5. They see it as trying to take the James Bond franchise in a very different direction that 2006 Casino Royale ultimately took the franchise, but this movie did it first nearly 2 decades earlier. And today, License to Kill is solidly considered a great film, currently holding an impressive 80% on Rotten Tomatoes. And John Glen, who directed this film, plus a total of 5 James Bond movies, more than any other director, has said that License to Kill is his favorite James Bond movie. And many modern critics implore Bond fans to give this movie a second look. And in the end, License to Kill did make a solid profit, more than enough to start production on a third Timothy Dalton James Bond movie. The third Timothy Dalton Bond film would have 007 fighting a Hong Kong-based industrialist named Sir Henry Ferguson, who was working with a Chinese military general, and the two were planning to take over Hong Kong. And the movie would have Bond travel to Vancouver, then Las Vegas, then to Hong Kong and China. And in 1991, the production was ready to go, and they were basically looking for a director when sudden legal troubles shut down production. The troubles occurred when an Australian financial company called Quintex tried to buy MGM UA for $1.5 billion. However, they could not get a letter of credit and the deal fell apart. Then Italian financier Giancarlo Peretti, who was the CEO of Pathé Entertainment, quickly moved in to purchase MGM UA for $1.2 billion. One problem, though, was that Giancarlo Peretti did not have $1.2 billion. But what he had was a very shady plan. And how he planned to finance the buyout was very shady indeed. Without yet owning MGM UA, Giancarlo Peretti went to multiple foreign broadcasting companies and he basically sold the international broadcasting rights of the MGM UA library, including the broadcasting rights of the 007 movies, without consulting nor paying the Broccoli family, who owns half the movies. He then planned to use the money to finance the purchase of MGM UA, which he would rename MGM Pathé. And he might have gotten away with it if it weren't for that pesky Cubby Broccoli. This basically left Danjaq, Broccoli's company, without any profits from the broadcasting rights. So of course Cubby Broccoli sued. Then Peretti countersued and it became a very ugly battle. And due to the lawsuit, Peretti's MGM Pathé went bankrupt. And in 1992, Credit Leonis took over MGM Pathé and renamed it MGM. And they settled with the Broccolis, and in 1993, they began development of the 17th James Bond film. And Dalton was still Broccoli's choice to play Bond, but Timothy Dalton's original 7-year contract with Danjaq expired that same year, 1993, and Cubby Broccoli insisted that Timothy Dalton sign a new contract for 3 or 4 more James Bond films. And Timothy Dalton chose not to reprise his role as 007. And this would lead Eon Films to go to Pierce Brosnan, starting the Brosnan era of 007. Well, that ends this video. Tune in next week where we're going to talk about a whole new era of James Bond in Pierce Brosnan's GoldenEye. And if you enjoyed this video, check out my other videos on other James Bond movies, on Star Trek, Star Wars, and comedies like Airplane and Popeye, plus many, many more. That ends this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a great time.